Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was during one of those rare and untroubled weeks in early autumn, when the city had not yet fallen under the dreary oppression of fog and sleet, that I found myself seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our sitting room at Baker Street. The morning sunlight slanted through the windows, catching in the curling smoke from Holmes' pipe and casting shifting shadows across his scattered newspapers and chemical apparatus. For once, all was tranquil. Holmes was unusually silent that morning, gazing at a stack of theatre playbills as though they were cryptic telegrams from some foreign land. He had not spoken in nearly an hour, save to mutter, "Curious, curious," under his breath every so often. I was about to comment on the rarity of such peace when a knock came at the door. A frantic, urgent pounding that shattered the stillness like a pistol shot. Mrs. Hudson opened it to reveal a pale young man, breathless and wide-eyed, his cravat loosened and his hands trembling like the leaves of a storm-tossed tree. "I must speak with Mr. Holmes, at once," he cried. "It's happened again." Holmes stood without a word and extended his hand. "Come in. Sit. Speak clearly." The young man obeyed, collapsing into a chair as if his knees had given way. "My name is Jasper Fenwick. I'm a violinist with the Sadler's Wells Theatre. I saw it happen with my own eyes, Mr. Holmes. Miss Larkspur is dead, just as the dance foretold." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "A dance? That foretold death?" Jasper nodded furiously. "It sounds mad, I know, but Miss Celestine Larkspur, the prima ballerina, performed the Dance Noir last night. It's an old routine, obscure, eerie. Legend has it that whoever performs the dance dies within 24 hours. I shifted uncomfortably. "Surely you don't believe such superstitions?" "I didn't. None of us did. But Miss Larkspur is dead, sir. She was found this morning in her dressing room. Locked from the inside, no wounds, no poison. Nothing amiss, except that same twisted pose from the final act of the dance." Holmes's eyes gleamed. He turned to me with that familiar spark I had come to know so well, the expression that foretold the beginning of another singular case. "Describe everything from last night," Holmes commanded. Jasper licked his lips. "It was a gala performance. Miss Larkspur insisted on reviving the Dance Noir for the final act. The audience was spellbound, some disturbed. She collapsed after the final pose, though she insisted she was merely exhausted. She laughed about the curse. We helped her to her dressing room, locked the door behind her as she requested. No one saw her afterward. This morning, she was found cold, lifeless, arms twisted as in the final tableau. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Nothing." Holmes was pacing now, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And this dance," he said, almost absently. "Is it always fatal?" Jasper nodded. "In every known case, yes. There are 3 historical records. Each ballerina died within a day. Some say it's cursed choreography. Others whisper of some dark influence, something occult. But it was supposed to be a myth." Holmes stopped mid-stride and turned to me. "Watson, this case bears the trappings of the supernatural. Yet you and I know the world turns not by phantoms, but by human motive and error. We must attend the theatre at once." Jasper stood, relief mingling with lingering fear. "Will you come today? Inspector Lestrade is already there, baffled." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then the matter is urgent indeed." The Sadler's Wells Theatre loomed tall and grey against the soft morning mist, its posters half torn and flapping in the breeze like morning banners. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and sombre, the scent of grease paint and velvet now overlaid with dread. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with a grim nod. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. I suppose you've heard." "We have," Holmes said briskly. "The scene remains untouched?" "As you requested, though I must say there's little to see. The door was locked from within. No marks of entry. No signs of violence, If it weren't for the expression on her face, I'd think she died in her sleep. Holmes arched an eyebrow. An expression? Lestrade led us to the dressing room. A uniformed constable stepped aside to let us enter. The room was modest, a gilt-framed mirror, powder tins and rouge scattered carelessly across the vanity. Costumes hung on pegs like frozen phantoms, and in the center lay the late Miss Larkspur. She was crumpled upon the floor, arms arched and twisted above her head, as if frozen mid-dance. Her eyes were wide, mouth parted, the faintest trace of a smile, or was it horror, etched across her pale lips. Holmes knelt beside her, silent. He examined the body without touching it, his eyes darting like a falcon's. "No trauma," he murmured. "No blood. No evident constriction around the neck. No residue on the lips. No odor of poison." He turned his attention to the room. The untouched makeup, the half-draped curtain over the single window, the unbroken seal on a carafe of water. Watson leaned forward, observing the corpse with unease. "She truly does resemble her final pose on stage, doesn't she?" "Yes," Holmes said, "too perfectly, almost staged. But why?" He rose suddenly and faced Lestrade. "I must view the theatre stage and then speak with the entire company, especially the choreographer. Tell them Sherlock Holmes requests their presence, and, Lestrade, find out who else has danced the Dance Noir in recent years, alive or dead." Lestrade blinked. "Do you suspect foul play, then?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Inspector, when a woman dies behind a locked door, in a pose foretold by ancient superstition, and without a single physical mark upon her, yes, I suspect foul play, and I intend to prove it." Watson felt a shiver run down his spine as Holmes strode toward the stage. Somewhere behind the curtains, the ghost of the Dance Noir still lingered. Its music silent, but its mystery only just beginning. Chapter 2. A Consultation in Baker Street. It was well past midday by the time we returned to Baker Street, and though Holmes's long strides carried him swiftly through the misty streets of London, I noted the furrow in his brow had deepened considerably. His silence, so often a precursor to discovery, this time held the weight of something else. Disquiet, perhaps even doubt. It was rare to see Holmes unnerved, and rarer still when the case was so young. We climbed the familiar steps to our sitting room, where the scent of old books, Turkish tobacco, and faint chemicals greeted us like old friends. Mrs. Hudson, sensing the gravity of our return, brought in tea without a word and vanished just as quietly. Holmes did not sit. Instead, he moved directly to the mantel and stood there, gazing into the unlit fireplace as if the ashes might whisper secrets to him. "Well, Watson," he said at last, his tone unusually grave. "What do you make of it?" I set down my hat and gloves, considering the question. "You mean Miss Larkspur's death?" "Naturally. Your impressions, man. Your clinical instincts unclouded by theatrical law." I stirred my tea. Medically, I saw no cause. No bruising, no hemorrhage, no sign of poison. Her expression was disturbing, yes, but not unnatural. Almost cataleptic. But what strikes me most is the timing. She dies alone, behind a locked door, in a pose that mirrors the finale of a morbid dance said to kill those who perform it. It's irrational, illogical. "Ah," Holmes said softly, "and yet here we are, confronted with the irrational made flesh. Or seemingly so." He turned from the hearth and began to pace, hands clasped behind his back. "There are three elements to this case that defy immediate explanation. First, the cause of death. Second, the method by which death was administered in a locked room. And third, and most troubling to me, the motive." "You think it a murder, then?" "My dear Watson, people do not simply contort themselves into balletic death poses by coincidence. And if this were the work of nature, she is showing a flair for theatre I've never seen her exercise before. I allowed a thin smile to play at the edge of my mouth. Then you suspect someone made it appear supernatural deliberately. Precisely. Which raises a question far more difficult than how, namely, why. Holmes paused before the sideboard, retrieved his long clay pipe, and began to fill it thoughtfully. The dance, he said after a moment, is key. This danse noire. I've never heard of it before. Have you? No, though I'm hardly versed in ballet. Nor I. But I intend to remedy that tonight. We must view the full choreography. I have requested a rehearsal from the company. If Miss Larkspur truly performed this death dance, then every step, every gesture, was perhaps meant to convey more than art. It may be the only statement she had time to make. He lit the pipe, drawing in a long breath before exhaling slowly. Let us consider our facts. Miss Larkspur was healthy and vibrant not 24 hours ago. She requested to perform a notorious routine. After the performance, she secluded herself. This morning she is found dead, with no clear medical cause, her body contorted into a final pose that mimics the last gesture of the dance. He began to pace again. Now, from a logical standpoint, one must assume she was either murdered or driven to death through suggestion, though I am loath to believe in such dramatic psychosomatic collapse. There was no forced entry. The door was locked from within. The windows were barred, no food or drink consumed, and no visible injuries. Perhaps poison introduced through the air? Unlikely. There was no sign of asphyxia, and the carafe in her dressing room remained sealed. Besides, poison by vapor is a theatrical notion best left to cheap novels. What about something topical, absorbed through the skin? Holmes paused, eyes narrowing. That is a possibility, but even such methods leave trace evidence. Miss Larkspur's skin was clear, too clear, in fact. I'll need to request a post-mortem with a full histological examination. I sipped my cooling tea. And what of the legend surrounding the dance? Jasper Fenwick believed in it. Some of the others may as well. Precisely the danger, Watson. Superstition breeds distraction. It fogs the mind with illusion. If someone used that legend as cover, a smokescreen to commit murder, then we must find them quickly, before another dancer falls victim to this phantom. I glanced toward the morning paper Holmes had discarded earlier. The theater would be all over the social pages by now. Holmes followed my gaze. The press will sensationalize this within hours, if they haven't already. We must get ahead of it. You saw Fenwick's face. He believed he'd watched a woman dance her way to death. He seemed sincere, which makes him dangerous. A sincere witness can spread fear like plague. Just then, a tap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson peeked in. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but a letter just arrived. Courier, very rushed. Holmes took the envelope and opened it at once. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, then handed it to me. It was written in a feminine hand, sharp, elegant, with flourishes. Mr. Holmes, if you value life, your own and others, do not continue with the investigation into Celestine Larkspur's death. There are forces involved which no man may safely uncover. Some dances are not meant to be understood. Some truths are fatal. A friend of the stage. Holmes gave a dry chuckle. Ah, the anonymous warning, a staple of melodrama. I frowned. It must be a hoax, or someone close to the company. Both, perhaps. But even melodrama bears clues, Watson. He held the letter up to the light, examining the watermark. This was written on Théâtre de Minuit stationery. French, rare, imported, likely only in specialized shops. The ink, green-tinted with high nickel content, used primarily by left-handed writers to avoid smudging. He inhaled deeply. Perfumed, a trace of orange blossom. The writer is a woman, recently arrived from Paris with access to luxury items and a flair for the dramatic. I shook my head in wonder. And all that from a note. Holmes smiled. The real question is not who wrote it, but why. Fear, guilt, or a warning meant to divert us from something they're desperate to protect. He walked to the window, gazing down at Baker Street, where the fog had begun to gather again like silent witnesses to some coming storm. We'll return to the theatre this evening, Watson, and if the dead cannot speak, then I shall make the living dance. Chapter 3. The First Clues. A Scene of Deception. We returned to Sadler's Wells that evening as dusk settled over London like a velvet curtain. The theatre, already dim by nature, seemed darker still, its flickering gas lamps casting long, uncertain shadows across the maroon carpets and faded gilt moulding. A hush hung in the air, not unlike that of a church after some unspeakable tragedy. The usual bustle of rehearsals and backstage murmuring was replaced with whispered speculation and stifled gasps at our presence. Holmes strode ahead of me, his coat flaring behind him like a shadow. The stage manager, a grizzled man with a rheumy eye named Bram Chiswick, led us through the rear hallway toward the dressing rooms. "Miss Larkspur's room is as you left it, sir," Chiswick said. "Inspector Lestrade locked it after your visit and gave me the key. Said it was to stay untouched until you returned." "Very wise," Holmes replied with a nod. "And the company?" "Gathered on stage, just like you asked, though they're nervous. Half of them think they're next. If they hadn't had contracts signed in blood, I dare say they'd have fled by now." Holmes said nothing as we entered the corridor, but I noted how his eyes swept across the floorboards, the doors, even the low ceiling beams. He missed nothing. Every speck of dust, every scratch in the wood seemed to register in his mind like a word in a secret language. We reached the dressing room and paused. Holmes took the key, held it lightly in his palm, and then turned to me. "Observe, Watson," he said. "This key was handed to us by Chiswick, who received it from Lestrade. It has not left his person since. Yet the question remains, was the room truly sealed when the body was found? You suspect someone tampered with the scene. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone counted on us believing they hadn't." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The dressing room was just as we had left it. The vanity's mirror reflected our faces, pale and tired under the yellow lamplight. Miss Larkspur's costume still hung like silent ghosts along the wall. A faint trace of her perfume lingered in the air, something floral and faintly musky, like lilies wilting in a crypt. Holmes moved forward at once, circling the room slowly. He crouched beside the empty spot on the floor where the dancer's body had lain and stared at the carpet. Then he produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket and leaned in. I remained by the door, hands behind my back, watching him at work. "Note this," Holmes murmured. "No blood? No impression in the pile of the rug suggesting a struggle. But here, look closer, Watson. The dust." I stepped forward and followed the point of his magnifying glass. "The dust has been disturbed in a circular shape," he continued. "And see this thread? Green, metallic, not from her costume. From another dancer's costume, perhaps. Possibly, or a visitor. This thread was snagged here, on the leg of the chair. Someone else was in this room, but the door was locked. Indeed. And that, Watson, is precisely what makes it interesting." He stood abruptly and turned to the mirror above the vanity. "Now this is where it becomes theatrical." He gestured toward the mirror. "Note the angle. When one sits here, preparing for a performance, the entire door is visible in the reflection. She would have seen someone enter, unless—" He trailed off, stepping to the side. I watched as he examined the makeup tins, the water carafe, the brushes and powders. His fingers hovered over each item but touched none. "Poison in the powder," I offered. "No, too crude, too imprecise. But this—" He lifted a small bottle. "This is intriguing." He held it to the light. "A skin balm. Lavender oil, imported. Common enough, except... He uncorked the bottle and sniffed. Then he passed it to me. Smell that? I did. The lavender was unmistakable, but beneath it, something sharp and acrid tickled my nose. Chloroform? I asked. Possibly, or a derivative. Enough to induce faintness, confusion. She may have applied it unknowingly. But how would it cause death? It wouldn't, not directly. But if it rendered her unconscious at the wrong moment, and another hand guided her final movements... I stepped back, chilled. You think someone was here, used this substance to disorient her, and then posed her. Or frightened her into believing the dance had come true. And fear, Watson, can kill as surely as any blade. Before I could reply, we heard footsteps in the hall. Chiswick reappeared. The dancers are ready, Mr. Holmes. Shall I take you to them? Please, Holmes said, pocketing the small thread from the rug. And I'll need to speak with Miss Larkspur's understudy, if she had one. Chiswick scratched his head. That would be Miss Vivian Moreau, new girl, just joined the company a month ago. French. A bit odd, but talented. Excellent, Holmes replied. Let's begin. The stage was bathed in a melancholy blue light. The dancers, 8 in total, stood nervously along the wings as Holmes and I stepped onto the wooden boards. Some whispered to each other, others stared straight ahead, as if by sheer focus they could will the moment to pass. Holmes walked slowly down the center of the stage, hands behind his back. I will not keep you long, he said, voice low and calm. But I ask you to be truthful. Not just for your sake, but for the safety of all. He turned toward the gathered troupe. Who here knew the origins of the Danse Noire before last night? A few hands rose, hesitantly. And who objected to Miss Larkspur's decision to perform it? A pause. Then one hand rose, a man in his 40s with sharp cheekbones and graying hair. My name's Elliot Venn, he said. I've been dancing with the company 15 years. I told Celestine she was mad to do it. I told her it was cursed. And yet you let her dance? I'm not the director, he muttered. Holmes nodded. And who choreographed last night's rendition? Another figure stepped forward. A woman in dark grey, tall, thin, with striking eyes, and a voice like cold steel. I did, she said. Madame Lysandra Vale. I've choreographed for this company for 12 years. Celestine insisted on authenticity. I warned her as well. And Miss Moreau? Holmes asked. A slender figure in black stepped forward from the back. She could not have been more than 22, pale with raven hair tied in a tight bun. Her eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, and she held her hands clasped in front of her with a dancer's discipline. I was to understudy her, she said softly but clearly. Celestine never believed the dance was dangerous. She said she wanted to feel something ancient again. Holmes looked at her for a long moment. And what did you believe, Miss Moreau? She met his gaze with something like defiance. I believe the past is not always the past. Sometimes it waits for us. Holmes nodded slightly, then turned to me. Come, Watson. I believe the stage has spoken, but not clearly enough. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The gas lamps along the corridor sputtered and hissed as Holmes and I made our way back toward the theater's private salon, a room used for company meetings, but now transformed into an impromptu chamber of inquiry. The dancers followed in silence, their slippers whispering over the floorboards like nervous ghosts. Holmes had requested each principal member of the company be brought in for individual conversation. Not interrogation, not yet, but conversation. He believed that the truth, when nudged with the right question, had a way of revealing itself. People lie, he had once told me, but they rarely lie well. Their falsehoods are usually embroidered with inconsistencies they do not notice. It is not their words, but their contradictions that we must learn to read. And so, with that philosophy in mind, we waited as the first subject entered the salon. 1. Elliot Venn. The veteran dancer stepped into the room, back rigid, arms folded tightly across his chest. His grizzled hair gave him the air of a Shakespearean actor long past his prime, and his voice still bore the clipped elegance of old theatre halls. "You disagreed with Miss Larkspur's choice of routine," Holmes said. "I did. Openly. The danse noire isn't just choreography, it's theatre necromancy. At least, that's what people whisper. And yet you danced with her that night. I had no choice. The audience was there. The curtain had already lifted. Celestine was always persuasive." Holmes regarded him. Persuasive or manipulative? Venn hesitated. A bit of both. Holmes leaned forward. "You knew her well. Well enough to know she didn't care whose toes she stepped on. She used people, Mr. Holmes, and if someone's finally had enough, well, I wouldn't be surprised." Holmes paused. "Did you love her?" Venn's jaw tightened. "Once, years ago. She didn't return it. She never returned anything." Holmes made a slight note in his pocketbook and dismissed the man without comment. 2. Madame Lysandra Vale. The choreographer followed, draped in a cloak of grey wool and the air of someone who had once been beautiful in a hard, angular way. "Miss Larkspur insisted on authenticity," Holmes began. "She always did," Vale replied coolly. "Celestine believed art should hurt, and if it hurt others in the process, well, that was simply part of the sacrifice. You warned her." "I did. Not because I believed in curses, but because I knew the toll it would take. The danse noire is violent, exhausting. It draws something from the performer. The original score was banned after 3 dancers collapsed during rehearsal. I reconstructed it at Celestine's request." "And you never questioned why she was so determined?" "Oh, I questioned everything she did. But she had the audience in the palm of her hand. The company revolved around her. The directors bow to her whims. And when the prima ballerina demands the dance of death, you stage it or you resign. Why didn't you?" "I needed the money. And truth be told, I wanted to see if she'd pull it off. She always thought herself untouchable." Holmes nodded, satisfied. "That will be all, madame." 3. Jasper Fenwick. The young violinist returned, fidgeting with his cuffs. "You discovered the body," Holmes said. "Yet you didn't call for help immediately." I froze. I knocked, and when she didn't answer, I fetched Chiswick. He forced the door. "You and Miss Larkspur, were you close?" Fenwick's cheeks flushed. Not intimately, but she was kind to me. Encouraging." "Did you see her before the performance?" "Yes, backstage. She was nervous, pale, but she insisted on going through with it. She said something odd, though." Holmes raised a brow. "What was that?" "She said, 'If I don't do this tonight, I'll never be free.'" Holmes leaned back in his chair, absorbing the words. "Free from what, do you think?" Fenwick shook his head. "I don't know, but she looked haunted." Holmes gave a tight nod and sent him away. 4. Vivienne Moreau. The French understudy entered like a shadow, silent, composed, eyes unreadable. She did not sit until Holmes gestured. "You are next in line for the role," he said without preamble. "So they say," she replied in a soft accent. "But Celestine would never allow anyone else to shine." "You resented her?" Vivienne blinked. "She was the sun. We all revolved around her, but even the sun burns out." "Why did you join the company?" "Opportunity. Escape. Paris was complicated." "And you knew the legend of the dance?" "I knew the shape of it, but I do not fear shadows." Holmes tilted his head. "Then what do you fear, Miss Moreau?" For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. Being forgotten, she said, like so many dancers who give their lives to the stage and leave nothing behind. Holmes smiled faintly. A reasonable fear. Thank you. 5. Bram Chiswick. The stage manager returned last, his grizzled features more anxious than before. You've been with the company the longest, Holmes said. Aye, 26 years. Seen dancers come and go, scandals too. And deaths? Chiswick swallowed. A few. Overwork, illness, nothing like this. You had access to the dressing rooms. I have keys, but I never used them that night, I swear on my mother's grave. Did you see anyone enter Miss Larkspur's room after the performance? No, not a soul. Holmes nodded. But did you hear anything? Chiswick hesitated. Now that you mention it, there was something, around midnight, a sound, like humming, a woman's voice, faint, eerie. I thought it was someone rehearsing late. Holmes's eyes lit with sudden interest. And where were you when you heard it? Backstage, near the prop closet. I followed the sound, but it stopped. Figured it was my ears playing tricks. Was it music from the dance noir? Chiswick frowned. Couldn't say, but it gave me chills. Holmes thanked him and stood. When the interviews concluded, Holmes and I lingered on the empty stage. The footlights were dark, only the echo of our footsteps remained. Well, I asked, what do you think? I think, Holmes said quietly, we are among performers, and performance is the art of concealing truth. He walked to center stage and looked down at the floorboards. One of these people is lying, not all the time, but in moments, tiny slips, the kind that betray a story rehearsed too well. Do you have a suspect? Holmes gave a thin smile. I have 5, but only one had the motive, the means, and the nerve to turn a death into a myth. And the locked room? He tapped his temple. There are always ways in, Watson, and always ways out. The trick is finding the one that leaves no trace, unless you know where to look. He straightened his coat. Come, tonight we rest. Tomorrow we unravel. Chapter 5. First Suspects, the Red Herring. The following morning dawned grey and thick with drizzle, the streets of London gleaming like polished slate beneath the slow weeping of the sky. Holmes, ever unaffected by weather or discomfort, rose with a rare sense of urgency and set to work immediately. Our breakfast sat untouched on the table while he leaned over the corner of the carpet, dissecting yesterday's interviews with the same intensity he would apply to a rare poison or an unreadable cipher. Watson, he said, without turning from his notes, what strikes you as false about Elliot Venn? False? I frowned. He struck me as embittered, perhaps, but not dishonest. Holmes nodded. Bitterness can often wear the mask of truth. But remember what he said. She never returned anything. A clever phrase, and one meant to sound wounded. But according to Bram Chiswick, Venn and Larkspur were seen in whispered conversation on the night of the performance. Not argument. Intimacy. And that contradicts his disavowal. You believe he still cared for her? I believe, Holmes said, standing abruptly, that he may have loved her more than he admitted, and been spurned again. He moved to the mantel and lit his pipe, a sure sign that his thoughts had begun to take a more definite shape. But jealousy alone does not make a murderer. Means and opportunity must match motive, and in Venn's case, the opportunity was certainly there. He shared the stage with her during the Danse Noire. He had direct access. But if he did it, I said, why the theatrics? Why the locked door? Holmes blew a slow stream of smoke. Because, my dear Watson, theatrics are not mere distractions, they're narrative. Someone is telling a story, and Celestine Larkspur's death was its climax. He paused, glancing out the window where the morning rain blurred the edges of the city. I believe it's time we speak again with Scotland Yard. We found Inspector Lestrade in his office, tapping his fingers against a cluttered desk while reading a report with visible exasperation. He looked up at our entrance with the tired eyes of a man who had been given a puzzle and only half the pieces. "I hope you're here with answers," he muttered, "because I've got half the press barking about cursed dances, and the other half accusing us of covering up a murder." "We may be able to help," Holmes replied. "But first, tell me, what did the post-mortem report reveal?" Lestrade shuffled through the papers. "Not much. No toxins, no trauma, no signs of suffocation. The official cause is cardiac arrest, though that's just the coroner's way of saying, we don't know." He sighed. "Frankly, I was hoping you'd tell me something useful." "I intend to," Holmes said calmly. "Has Venn been questioned?" "Briefly. His alibi is that he went straight home after the show and didn't leave until morning. Says his landlady can confirm it. Which she does." Holmes murmured. "Convenient. Are you saying he's our man?" "I'm saying he's a man. Whether he's the one remains to be seen." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Then who else?" Holmes handed him the small green thread we had collected from Larkspur's dressing room. "Have this analyzed. It may belong to a costume, but not one worn by the deceased. I believe someone else entered that room after the performance." Lestrade frowned. "But the door, locked from the inside, yes. Still, there are methods. I'd like to examine the theater's architecture, particularly the crawl spaces and trapdoors." Lestrade stood with a sigh. "Back to the theater, then." Sadler's Wells was no less gloomy the second time. Rain tapped at the high-arched windows like impatient fingers. The house was empty now, the seats draped in dusty sheets, the stage eerily silent. Chiswick met us at the rear entrance with a lantern. "Trapdoors, you say?" he muttered, leading us into the wings. "There's one under the main stage, which has been there since the place was built. Used to be for quick changes or magical acts. Most don't even know it's still accessible." He brought us to a small, square hatch concealed behind the edge of the curtain. Holmes knelt, examined the lock, and pried it open. A faint, musty draught escaped. "A tunnel," he said. "Where does it lead?" "Beneath the stage and out to the old coal chute in the alley," Chiswick said. "We don't use it. Bit of a relic." Holmes descended carefully. I followed. The crawl space was low, damp, and pitch black save for Chiswick's lantern. We crept along the narrow passage, ducking rusted pipes and cobwebs, until we reached a wooden grate. A false wall, easily removed from this side. Holmes examined it in silence. "Here's your ghost," he said at last. "Anyone could have entered through this route, staged the scene, and locked the door from within." "But who would know of it?" I asked. Holmes gave me a look. "Anyone with a long history at this theatre. Chiswick, Venn, even Madame Vale. Or," I added, "someone who asked the right questions." Back above ground, Holmes remained unusually pensive. As we crossed the dim corridor past the dressing rooms, he paused suddenly and gestured toward a door. Vivienne Moreau's. It was ajar. Holmes knocked once, then entered without waiting. Vivienne stood near the window, her hands clasped at her back. She turned slowly, unsurprised. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "You knew about the trapdoor," he said without preamble. She didn't flinch. "I asked Chiswick about the theatre's history weeks ago. He mentioned it in passing. I didn't think it was relevant." "Did you tell anyone else?" "No." Holmes stepped closer. "You were Celestine's understudy, and yet you never rehearsed the Danse Noire." She forbade it, said it was hers alone. "Convenient." Her voice tightened. "I didn't kill her." Holmes tilted his head. "But perhaps you hated her." Silence. "She humiliated you, diminished you, refused to let you perform, and now she's gone, and already there are whispers that you should inherit the role." Vivienne's jaw clenched. "If you're accusing me, say it." "I'm observing," Holmes replied, and noting that among all the company, only you had motive, opportunity, and a clean alibi you arranged for yourself. You claimed to be asleep, alone. She took a step forward. And yet you don't know anything, do you? Holmes smiled faintly. Not yet. But the curtain hasn't fallen. As we stepped back into the evening fog, Holmes remained quiet until we reached the corner of Clerkenwell Road. Then he spoke, his voice low. Vivienne Moreau is either the victim of cruel ambition or its architect. But I don't believe she's the killer. Then who? That, Holmes said, is precisely the problem. Each suspect is both too obvious and not quite right. That, Watson, is the scent of a red herring. Someone has guided us toward Venn and Moreau because they knew we'd follow those trails. He looked up at the sky, the clouds now churning with approaching thunder. Which means the true killer is still hiding behind the legend, and we must find the clue that breaks the illusion. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet the following morning. He rose early, took only black coffee for breakfast, and spent the first 2 hours of daylight standing by the fireplace, staring not into the hearth, but at the mirror above it, as though the reflection might show him something the world had missed. When I ventured to interrupt his reverie, he lifted a single finger to silence me, then resumed his rigid stillness, his mind clearly chasing some elusive thread. It was nearly 10:30 when he finally moved, turning abruptly and reaching for his violin. He played not a tune but a sequence of notes, short, stabbing fragments of a melody I didn't recognize. Then, quite without warning, he stopped, placed the instrument down, and spoke. There's something wrong with the stage. I blinked. The stage? The choreography, the setting, the story we were told. I rose from my chair. What are you talking about? He began pacing, rapid and intense. Celestine Larkspur performed the Danse Noire, and afterward she collapsed. Everyone assumed exhaustion. Then she retired to her dressing room, locked the door, and was found dead the next morning. Correct? Yes. Then answer me this. If she collapsed at the end of the dance, as Fenwick claims, how did she have the strength to stand, walk unaided to her room, prepare herself for rest, and lock the door behind her? I paused. Adrenaline, perhaps? Or the collapse was theatrical, not genuine? Possibly. But now consider this. What if she never made it to her room at all? What if someone helped her there, so carried her? You mean she was already incapacitated? Or dying? That changes everything. Holmes moved to his desk and pulled from his drawer the original floor plan of the theatre Chiswick had provided him earlier. He unrolled it and tapped a point with his finger. Here is the stage, here the wings, and here, just adjacent, is the passageway that leads to the principal dressing rooms. Miss Larkspur's room is second on the left. He looked up. What if someone was waiting there, just out of sight, with the door already ajar? She stumbles from the stage, as expected. Someone helps her in. She's dazed, disoriented. They stage the scene. Lock the door behind them using a string and key mechanism, which is not difficult if you know the theatre's layout, and exit through the trap door. But why go to such lengths? I asked. Why create the illusion of a curse? Because, Holmes said quietly, if the death appeared natural or even suspicious, Scotland Yard would treat it like any other crime. But if it appeared supernatural, untouchable, then no one would look deeper. He began searching through the drawer, pulling out the scrap of green thread again, holding it up to the light. And this, Watson, is where our inconsistency becomes damning. He placed the thread on the desk beside a small playbill, one I hadn't seen before. It bore a date from 3 weeks prior and a cast list for a much older performance. Do you recognize the name stitched into the hem of the Danse Noire cloak? Holmes asked. I never saw it. It was embroidered in pale gold, nearly invisible unless you examine the garment closely. He leaned over the desk and tapped the name at the bottom of the cast list. Selina Crest. "Who is she?" I asked. "She was the original performer of the Danse Noire in Paris," Holmes said. "She collapsed after a performance at the Théâtre des Ombres and died within the week. But, listen carefully, her costume was never recovered. It vanished." My eyes widened. "You think Miss Larkspur wore it?" "She didn't just wear it. She sought it out, purchased it, perhaps even smuggled it from France. That cloak had become part of the legend, an icon. But here's the trick. The green thread we found in the dressing room wasn't from Larkspur's dress. It was from that cloak." I stared. But if Larkspur was wearing the cloak, of course the thread would be there. Holmes smiled thinly. "Ah, but she wasn't. According to the company wardrobe manager, the cloak had gone missing before the performance and was never returned. When the body was found, it wasn't in the dressing room, nor was it on her. She performed without it." I leaned forward. So whoever entered her dressing room wore the cloak, or carried it, perhaps to add to the myth, perhaps to conceal something else, but its disappearance is no coincidence. Holmes grabbed his coat. "We're going back to the theater, and this time we're looking not for a person, but for a relic." Sadler's Wells was deserted when we arrived, save for the hum of maintenance work and the occasional echo of voices in rehearsal halls above. Holmes moved with focused precision, cutting down corridors, opening closets and storage trunks, inspecting costume racks and prop cases. At last, in a forgotten alcove near the base of the old rigging chamber, he found it. A heavy cloak of green-black velvet with gold trim, folded haphazardly and stuffed behind a broken crate. Holmes lifted it with gloved hands. "Note the fraying here. Threads missing. Same texture as our sample. This is the cloak." I stared at it with sudden unease. There was something eerie in its presence, as if it had soaked up too many whispered legends and now exhaled them back into the world. Holmes examined the lining. "And look here. Watson, what do you make of this?" I stepped forward. Sewn into the inner hem was a small, near-invisible compartment, barely the size of a matchbox. Holmes slipped a gloved finger inside and pulled out a tiny glass ampule. It was empty. "There's our method," he murmured. "Liquid, likely absorbed through the skin. Possibly chloroform or a compound even subtler. Whoever planted this had knowledge of chemistry and precision." "And motive?" I asked. "That remains unclear. But whoever wore this cloak on the night of the performance carried both legend and murder on their shoulders." He wrapped it carefully in a cloth and turned to me. "Watson, we now know how. What remains is who, and, more pressingly, why. But I promise you this. The person who staged this illusion has already begun to unravel, because somewhere, whether in word, deed, or hesitation, they've made a mistake." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out the cloak, ampule, and theatre plans across the floor. He paced for nearly an hour in silence, drawing lines with chalk between items, scribbling notes in his ledger, circling back and crossing things out again. I sat nearby, still stunned by the strange, chilling artifact we had recovered. And then, just before dusk, Holmes stopped pacing. He turned to me, his expression sharper than I had seen it since the case began. "One of them lied, Watson." "Which one?" He smiled, that cold, anticipatory smile of a predator closing in. "I intend to find out. But when I ask my next question, they'll know I know." Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. It was 9:30 the following morning when Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, soaked to the knees and visibly agitated, bearing news that unsettled even Holmes. "There's been another incident," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through damp hair. "At Sadler's Wells again, and this time it wasn't subtle." Holmes, who had been seated in silence for the past hour, examining the ampule from the cloak under his magnifying lens, Didn't look up. Define incident, Lestrade. A fire. Dressing room corridor. Small but deliberate. Someone attempted to destroy part of the wardrobe storage. Possibly the cloak, though the reports are still unclear. Stagehand found the blaze just in time. Only superficial damage, but the message was clear. A cover-up, Holmes said, standing abruptly. Too late, of course. Lestrade nodded. You expected something like this? I expected desperation. It's always the inevitable consequence when a murderer realizes his mythology is beginning to unravel. I rose from my chair. Has anyone been hurt? Not physically, Lestrade replied, but the theatre's in uproar. Miss Danbury, the understudy, has refused to perform tonight. She claims the spirit of Celestine is haunting the building. Holmes turned to me with an arch of the brow. Superstition grows best in soil rich with fear, Watson. Our killer knows this. They're not simply trying to hide the truth, they're amplifying the myth. Why? I asked. He clasped his hands behind his back. Because they believe the myth will protect them, and so far, it has. We returned to Sadler's Wells before midday. The theatre's main entrance was closed, and a constable stood guard near the side alley. The scent of smoke still clung faintly to the backstage corridor. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Costumes removed from racks, blackened scorch marks staining one of the walls, the edges of fabric still singed. Mr. Fenwick met us near the stage apron, his face pallid and drawn. "This is madness, Mr. Holmes," he said, voice trembling. "We're supposed to debut Ariadne's Descent tonight, and the entire company is rattled. The fire, the death. Now half the dancers are refusing to return." Holmes offered no sympathy. "Do you recall, Mr. Fenwick, if the dressing room corridor was locked last night?" Fenwick shook his head. "Not to my knowledge. The janitor usually secures the main backstage doors, but individual rooms are the responsibility of the performers." Holmes nodded, then strode toward the wardrobe section, where 2 members of the maintenance crew were still inspecting the damage. "Tell me," Holmes said to one of them, "was anything missing after the fire?" "Hard to say, sir," the man replied. "There's so much chaos back here, you'd hardly notice if a cloak or 2 vanished." Holmes turned to me. "You recall the missing cloak, now found, was discovered well away from where it should have been. Someone moved it post-performance, then returned to destroy the evidence once they realized we were onto them. And that someone had access to this area even after hours," I added. "Indeed." Just then, a voice echoed from the wings. "Mr. Holmes?" It was the theatre's accompanist, a gaunt man named Archibald Leary, with yellowing fingers from nicotine and eyes too sharp for his own good. "I heard you were back," he said, "and I've something you ought to see." We followed him to the small piano alcove just stage left. Leary reached into a drawer beneath the sheet music stand and removed a folded envelope. "This slipped under my door this morning. No name, no seal." He handed it to Holmes, who opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a single scrap of paper bearing 2 typed sentences. "She was warned not to dance. Now another will follow. The curse is real." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Holmes read it twice, then handed it to Lestrade. A threat, or rather, a performance, a continuation of the myth. Leary frowned. "You think it's a hoax?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that someone is trying very hard to keep the theatre in a state of fear. Fear keeps people quiet. Fear ensures no one asks questions." Holmes turned suddenly. "I need to speak with Miss Danbury." Fenwick hesitated. "She's refused interviews, says she won't come back until the building is cleansed. Tell her Sherlock Holmes is not a ghost, and if she wants this nightmare to end, she will speak with me." Miss Evelyn Danbury was not what I expected. I had assumed a timid understudy, shaken, hysterical perhaps. But she was composed when we met her at her lodgings that afternoon, seated in a high-backed chair with a book of Keats open on her lap. "I'm not afraid of ghosts, Mr. Holmes," she said, lifting her eyes toward him. "I'm afraid of liars." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you'll forgive the directness of my questions." He moved to the window, gazing out into the street. "Why did you refuse to dance?" "Because Celestine warned me," she said. "Before her death?" Danbury nodded. 2 days before the premiere. We were alone in the dressing room. She told me the Danse Noire was not simply a performance. It was a summoning, that something had attached itself to the music, to the movement. She said every time she danced it, she felt a little less herself. Holmes turned back. "Did you believe her?" "I thought she was mad," Danbury said softly. "But then she died. And now someone is using her madness to hide something far worse." Danbury met Holmes' gaze evenly. "I think she was being watched. I think someone meant her harm, and they used her fear against her." Holmes moved closer. "Did she mention a name?" "No, but—" She hesitated. "Yes?" There was a note, torn, half crumpled. I found it in her costume pocket the morning after she died. It said, "He is watching. You should never have taken it." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Do you still have it?" Danbury reached for a lacquered box beside her chair and produced the note. It was as she described, typed in the same manner as the theater threat. Holmes examined it under the light. "The ribbon impression is uneven. This was made on the same typewriter as the other message, perhaps even within the same day." He looked at me. "The dance was not the cause, Watson. It was the pretext. Something Celestine did. Something she took. Put her in someone's crosshairs. The cloak, perhaps. Or something older." Danbury's voice was barely a whisper. "What if she knew a secret? Someone wanted to stay buried?" Holmes turned to her. "My dear Miss Danbury, I have no doubt about it." As we returned to Baker Street that evening, the fog had begun to rise over the cobbled streets, thick and slow like spilled ink. Holmes said nothing for nearly the entire cab ride, but his fingers twitched against his thigh in that familiar rhythm I'd come to associate with his deepest concentration. When we arrived, he went straight to the fire, poured himself a glass of claret, and stood in silence. At last I asked, "What troubles you?" He didn't look at me. "There's a memory forming, Watson. Something from another case. Something that stinks of similar perfume, but I cannot yet name it." He lifted the glass to his lips, then set it down untouched. "Tomorrow we will speak again with Fenwick, and this time, not as guests." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The next morning, Holmes was already dressed and pacing the parlor long before I had stirred from bed. His pipe lay cold on the mantel, untouched, a sign that he was so consumed by thought he had forgone even his habitual comfort. He had placed 3 objects in a precise triangle on the floor, the note from Celestine's pocket, the ampule recovered from the cloak, and a page torn from a program for Ariadne's descent. "You're forming a constellation," I said, buttoning my waistcoat. "A constellation, yes," he murmured. "But it is not the stars that matter, Watson. It's the darkness between them." He straightened. "Come. Today we lit a lantern." When we arrived once more at Sadler's Wells, Mr. Fenwick was nowhere to be seen. Holmes, ignoring the protests of a junior assistant at the stage door, swept through the corridor like a man who belonged there. I followed quickly, tugging my hat lower to avoid recognition. Holmes's first stop was the orchestra pit, now empty in the early daylight hours. He ran his hand lightly over the music stands, pausing only when he reached the conductor's podium. A smudge of oil, barely visible, clung to the edge of the baton holder. "Curious," he murmured. "Oil from an instrument?" I suggested. "Possibly. But tell me, Watson, do you recall Miss Danbury's words? That Celestine felt as though something was summoned by the dance." "I do. And do you recall the peculiar lighting used during her final performance?" You mentioned it in passing in your notes. The reddish hue, like firelight. Yes, I remember. It was almost infernal in tone. Holmes gave a tight nod. Then let us descend. Beneath the main stage lay the undercroft, an area used for rigging, trapdoors, and the aged mechanical systems that had long supported the theatre's illusions. We were met with a heady scent of damp wood and rust. Lanterns flickered along the walls like half-awake sentries. Holmes led us with the certainty of a man who had already charted the map in his mind. At last, we arrived at a low storeroom beneath the revolving stage platform. He knelt and pried open a battered cabinet, revealing a shelf of strange equipment, a box of colored filters, several gels, and a rusting tin marked K-Red Flame. Magnesium blend, handle with caution. Holmes picked it up gently. This was used during the final movement of the Danse Noire, he said. Not stage-safe by traditional standards, but very effective at conjuring dread. Deliberate misdirection? I asked. Precisely. To make it appear that Celestine collapsed from supernatural terror. In truth, I believe her death was chemical, neither spontaneous nor spiritual. He rose. But let us not overreach. We must test the theory, and for that I must speak not with the performers, but the one who sees everything. Archibald Leary, the accompanist, met us in the cramped green room, still wearing the same ink-stained waistcoat from the previous evening. He looked wary but intrigued. Holmes gestured for him to sit. Mr. Leary, you are the unseen eye of the performance, the ear that hears rehearsals no one else attends. Tell me, did Celestine argue with anyone in the week leading to her death? Leary scratched his head. A few tiffs with Fenwick, but that was usual. She didn't like being handled, as she put it. She felt he was pushing her too hard for the premiere. Anyone else? Holmes pressed. A pause. There was something odd about the night before she died, Leary said slowly. After rehearsals, I stayed late to mark some bars. I heard voices in the gallery. Celestine and someone else. A man. She sounded frightened. He kept repeating something. It doesn't belong to you. Holmes leaned forward. Did you recognize the voice? No, but the tone, it was cultured. Not a stagehand. More educated. It could have been a patron. Thank you, Holmes said, already turning to leave. Outside the green room, Holmes said nothing until we were halfway back to the cab. Watson, think carefully. What connects a poisoned ampule, a missing cloak, a terrified dancer, and the phrase, "You should never have taken it"? A theft, I answered. She took something someone wanted returned. Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed, and not just anything. Something valuable, something irreplaceable. We arrived at the National Library within the hour. Holmes requested the theatre's historical records, particularly any acquisitions from the 18th or early 19th centuries. After a short wait, a young attendant returned with a worn leather folio. Inside, we discovered entries cataloging costumes, manuscripts, set designs, and one item listed curiously as Nocturne of Shadows, anonymous composition, accompanied by dance notation, donated anonymously, 1811. Legend claims the piece induces hysteria if performed under red firelight. Stored with costumes in Vault B. Holmes tapped the page. There. Not merely a score, but a myth. The very sort of artifact that attracts both collectors and fanatics. Do you believe Celestine found this and decided to use it? I asked. I believe someone found it first, likely Fenwick, and adapted the Danse Noire using its choreography. But Celestine may have discovered the original document. Perhaps she took it to protect it, or expose the danger. And in doing so, she signed her death warrant. That evening, Holmes orchestrated what he called a performance of shadows. He requested a private rehearsal be held, inviting only Fenwick, Danbury, Leary, and the theatre's principal benefactor, a retired diplomat named Sir Thaddeus Greaves. Holmes had prepared the space with meticulous detail. The stage was darkened. Only a single red spotlight lit the center. Miss Danbury was instructed to stand precisely where Celestine had during her final dance. And then Holmes began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said from the gallery, his voice echoing, "you're not here to watch a performance, but to be part of a test. This room has been prepared exactly as it was on the night of Celestine Montrose's death." Gasps fluttered. Fenwick rose, indignant. "I won't allow this mockery." "You will sit," Holmes snapped, "or I shall place you under suspicion." He raised a vial. "In my hand is a sample of the same chemical used in the red flame magnesium mixture. When vaporized and combined with a rare neurotoxin delivered via the cloak fibers, it produces symptoms akin to cardiac failure, hallucinations, paralysis, death." A silence followed. Sir Thaddeus leaned forward. "Are you accusing someone here of murder?" "I am suggesting," Holmes said coldly, "that Celestine Montrose was murdered not because of superstition, but because she found something that someone else wanted to remain hidden. And tonight I believe the murderer will reveal themselves, not through confession, but through fear." He turned to Leary. "Play the original nocturne, please." Slowly. As the first haunting bars filled the air, Miss Danbury began to move, not dancing, but merely stepping into the light. Holmes watched the room, his gaze fixed not on the stage, but on the audience. And then I saw it too. A flicker in Fenwick's hand, a clenched fist, a glance toward his coat pocket. Holmes descended the stairs. "No need to reach for it, Mr. Fenwick. The document is already in police custody." Fenwick stood, eyes wide. What document?" "The one you attempted to burn during yesterday's fire," Holmes said softly. "The nocturne's original score." Fenwick's face was drained of color. "I don't know what you mean." "You knew its value," Holmes pressed. "You planned to sell it. Celestine discovered the truth. And she paid for it." The rehearsal room fell into stunned silence. Fenwick swayed, and for the first time I saw true fear in the eyes of a man who had, until now, played only roles. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. Holmes, it must be said, rarely left a confrontation unfinished. Yet after exposing Fenwick's furtive guilt and rattled demeanor during our dramatic test, he did not demand his arrest. "Too soon," Holmes told me quietly as we left the theater. "The beast is cornered, yes, but still capable of striking." "Then why not alert Inspector Lestrade immediately?" I asked, puzzled. "Because what we have, my dear Watson, is motive and suspicion, but not proof. The letter was burned, the ampule discarded. We've assembled a pattern, but to trap the spider, we must first allow it to believe its web remains undisturbed." I grumbled. "Sometimes I wonder whether justice is best served cold, or just delayed." Holmes only gave that cryptic smile of his, the one I had long learned to interpret as, "Be patient. The storm is gathering." The next day passed with a strange tension, like the seconds before a thunderclap. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, declining all visitors, even Mrs. Hudson's offer of breakfast. He spent hours poring over old theater diagrams, studying lighting schedules, and even consulting an obscure volume on criminal poisonings in French ballet houses, a fact that, to my knowledge, had no direct bearing on our case. By nightfall, however, he rose with sudden clarity and summoned me to dress sharply. "We dine at Greaves's townhouse this evening," he declared. "Sir Thaddeus Greaves?" "The same. A small affair, I'm told. A patron's supper for the surviving cast. Quite private, invitations only." "And how are we?" Holmes lifted a cream-colored card with elegant embossed letters. "An anonymous benefactor insisted we attend. Curious, don't you think? Greaves' Mayfair residence was a splendid Georgian structure, tastefully decorated with wide oak staircases and gaslight chandeliers casting golden halos on marble floors. We were received in the drawing room, where the cast of Ariadne's Descent stood like porcelain figures, each one subdued, uncertain, and unnerved by recent days. Fenwick was present, of course, his collar tight against his neck and hands, twitching against the wine-glass he refused to raise. Miss Danbury offered us a nervous smile. Archibald Leary remained by the piano, absently tapping keys as though summoning courage with each note. Sir Thaddeus Greaves, host and patron, appeared as polished and reserved as ever, though Holmes eyed him with particular interest. Greaves had inherited considerable wealth from colonial ventures, and now used it, as he often proclaimed, to enrich the soul of Britain through the arts. Dinner was quiet, almost funereal in its restraint. It wasn't until the final course, poached pears in port wine, that the evening took a sudden turn. Greaves stood, glass raised. "To Celestine," he said solemnly. "Gone too soon, yet immortal in our memory. Let this be the last shadow her death casts." A murmured "Hear, hear" passed through the room, and then came a knock, not from the front door, but from within the house. 3 distinct, deliberate raps, echoing from behind the far wall. Everyone froze. Greaves paled. "The library," he whispered. It came from the library. Holmes was already moving, with me close behind. The other guests hesitated before following. Greaves unlocked the door and entered. The fire had long burned down, casting faint light over an armchair and a side table with brandy. But what drew our attention was the dark red smear on the Persian rug. Holmes crouched, inspecting it. "Blood," he said flatly. Leary gasped. "Someone's hurt. There." He pointed to a body slumped behind the settee. It was one of the theatre's assistant stagehands, Thomas Brinkley, I later learned, a quiet lad of 22. He was alive, but barely, his breathing ragged, a letter clutched in his shaking hand. I bent to examine the wound, a deep stab just beneath the rib cage. "Call for a surgeon at once," I said. "And keep pressure. He's losing blood rapidly." Holmes pried the letter from the young man's grip, scanning it quickly before tucking it into his coat. "Who found him?" demanded Fenwick, looking around with genuine alarm. "No one," Holmes said softly. He knocked to summon help. Miss Danbury shook her head. "But why would anyone hurt Thomas? He was barely involved in the production." Holmes turned, eyes hard. "Because Thomas saw something, or was about to say something. The killer realized the circle was tightening and struck preemptively." Sir Thaddeus, clearly shaken, retreated to pour himself brandy. Holmes motioned for me to follow him out. Back in the cab, under gaslight and fog, I finally asked, "What was in the letter?" Holmes withdrew it from his pocket. The handwriting was rough but legible. "Mr. Holmes, I ain't got much courage, but I heard what that man said to Miss Celestine. I saw him give her something backstage. Looked like an envelope. I didn't think anything of it until she died. I kept it quiet. But I heard him say he'd handle her silence. I think he meant to do her harm. I'll tell you the rest if I can get away unseen." "Thomas? Envelope?" I said. "Could that have been the original score?" "Likely," Holmes murmured. "And now our stagehand lies stabbed in a patron's home during a dinner meant to close the curtain on this tragedy." "You believe the killer was one of the guests?" "Unquestionably. And now the crime has grown darker. It is no longer an act of greed, but one of desperation." Later that night, as Holmes sat in our parlor by the fire, I saw that strange light in his eyes, the same he wore before solving the case of the speckled band or the Musgrave ritual. "The killer is pressed," he said finally. "They struck again, but in doing so, they've given us what we lacked before." "What's that?" a pattern of behavior, and a corner into which they've painted themselves. He reached into his drawer and removed a fresh telegram. Lestrade has received it. Scotland Yard will move tomorrow, but not yet. One more card remains unplayed. I frowned. What are we waiting for? Holmes tapped his fingers together. For the truth, Watson, but not just any truth. The kind that reveals itself not with words, but with reaction. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Holmes stirred from his reverie. He had sat, unmoving, in his armchair since we returned from Greaves' supper, his fingers steepled, his brow furrowed as though threading needles through shadows. Outside, Baker Street lay in a hush of fog and silence, save for the occasional clatter of distant hoofbeats. "Watson," he said, at last breaking the stillness, "do you recall what Miss Celestine said about the original choreography?" "Yes," I said, straightening. "That someone had demanded changes to it, threatened her if she didn't alter the final dance." Holmes nodded. "The music, Watson. That's the key. We've spoken much of poison and suspicion, but little of the true canvas upon which this crime was painted, the performance itself." I blinked. "You believe the motive lies in the art?" "In what was hidden in it, yes. This crime was never about mere jealousy or greed. It's far older and more intricate. I believe Celestine was in possession of something dangerous, something someone else had once buried in that score. A secret. A truth," Holmes said softly. "Encoded, as it were, in movement and rhythm. The original choreography was altered not out of artistic preference, but to obscure. Celestine, I suspect, had uncovered the original intent of the dance and was determined to reveal it, perhaps even during the final performance." I felt a chill. "And someone silenced her to prevent that revelation?" "Exactly. But who would go to such lengths to erase a memory buried in a dance?" Holmes stood abruptly and strode to the desk, removing a folded sheet from beneath a stack of correspondence. It was a list of names, members of a now-defunct society titled the Phoenix Circle of Aesthetic Studies, dated 1886. "At Greaves's estate," Holmes said, "I spotted a curious plaque above the library hearth. It bore the symbol of the Phoenix Circle, a private coterie of artists, philosophers, and patrons who believed certain truths of the human condition could only be expressed through coded art." I glanced at the list. Greaves was a member, and not the only one. Fenwick, Leary, even Celestine's mentor, a choreographer named Myra Vallette, all once belonged, but the circle disbanded after a scandal in '87, one involving accusations of subversive imagery hidden in their works. Most of the members vanished into obscurity or fled England entirely. Then this dance was never simply a ballet, it was a cipher, a final act of revelation, long delayed. Later that morning, we returned to the theatre. It stood empty now, the stage bare, its wings like the hollow ribs of a cathedral. The scene of Celestine's collapse had been scrubbed clean, but an air of sorrow still clung to the velvet and ash. Holmes moved with silent precision, retracing her final movements as though inhabiting her ghost. He paused at center stage, turning toward the rafters. This is where she would have faced the audience, arms raised, final pose. Then he whispered, almost to himself, she wasn't dancing for applause. She was pointing. To what? Holmes stepped backward, aligning himself carefully with the far wall. To the royal box, directly above Greaves' usual seat. A subtle accusation, Watson, hidden in her final gesture. He turned back to me. I believe Celestine knew who the killer was, and she tried to expose them not with words, but with her body, with her art. As we descended into the lower wings, Holmes stopped before a door marked Storage, Choreography Archives. He produced a small theater master key, no doubt acquired earlier with quiet stealth. Inside, he found what he sought, a worn leather folio containing Valette's original notations for Ariadne's descent. Several pages had been torn out, but what remained bore scribbled annotations in French, some of them encircled with violent red ink. Holmes studied a diagram closely. This sequence here, La Danse de la Vérité, was removed entirely in the final version, but Célestine had restored it. A beat passed, then, "Watson, do you recognize the pattern?" I peered closer. The movements, when diagrammed, formed angular symbols, not unlike letters. It looked like a message. Holmes nodded. A message. A confession of sorts. Perhaps implicating someone or revealing a truth too dangerous for the public. He straightened. This is what she died for, and what the killer feared most. As we emerged back onto the fog-drenched street, Holmes was silent again, but I saw something new in his posture, an anticipation, almost an eagerness. "What's next?" I asked him. He gave a rare smile. "Now, Watson, we set the stage for their final performance." Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' Grand Strategy. The following morning found Holmes uncharacteristically animated. He paced our sitting room with a feline intensity, his eyes flashing with calculation as he outlined his plan. "We are dealing, Watson, with a mind that has grown too comfortable in the shadows. Our opponent believes themselves unseen, clever, insulated by time and obscurity. That is always their undoing." He stopped by the fireplace, tapping a finger against his chin. "I shall draw them out." "By doing what?" I asked cautiously. "By letting them believe they've won." Before I could question further, he abruptly crossed to the desk and retrieved an envelope. Inside was a single sheet on which he had scrawled, in block letters, a short theatrical announcement, a one-night reprise. The final dance, as it was meant to be an encore performance of Ariadne's descent, featuring original choreography. Below that, revised by Myra Valette, restored by M. Célestine, deceased. "Surely you don't mean to—" "Oh, but I do," Holmes said, slipping the sheet into another envelope. "We will distribute this to all the principal figures involved. Greaves, Leary, even Fenwick. It will never come to performance, of course. The announcement alone will suffice." To do what? To provoke panic. The notice was dispatched by noon, courtesy of a trusted messenger. Within hours, Holmes had arranged a closed rehearsal at the Royal Theatre for the following evening. A dancer of remarkable talent, one Miss Clara Norwood, was summoned in secrecy. She bore a striking resemblance to Célestine from a distance, and more importantly, had studied under Valette herself. Holmes provided her with the original diagrams we had recovered, and the young woman, with a touch of reverence, promised to perform it precisely as written. "She will not dance for an audience," Holmes told me that night, "but for a murderer who believes her dead secret has risen from the grave." That same evening, Holmes visited the theater's lighting technician and gave very specific instructions. A hidden panel would allow the stage to be observed in total darkness from the rear mezzanine. I accompanied him to the catwalk later to survey the vantage point. From there, one could see every movement below: the dancer, the wings, even the box seats, where our true trap was laid. "You believe the killer will attend?" I asked him, whispering into the stillness. Holmes didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted across the empty rows as though he could already see the spectre approaching. "They cannot afford not to. This is no longer about revenge or misdirection. It is about preservation. Their only hope now lies in ensuring that dance is never seen again." At precisely 7 o'clock the following evening, the stage was lit in a soft amber glow. Miss Norwood stood poised at the center, robed in white, her face pale beneath powdered cheeks. She moved with solemn grace, each step echoing the deliberate rhythm of the old choreography. Holmes and I watched from our hidden perch, our breaths shallow, our ears tuned not to the dance but to the sounds of arrival. Below, one by one, the key players took their places. Greaves, expression unreadable in his box. Fenwick, visibly anxious in the third row, and Leary, who sat oddly at ease, as if daring the ghosts to speak. But Holmes's eyes were not on any of them. They were fixed on a shadowy figure that had slipped in last, the figure in the upper left gallery, robed in a dark overcoat and seated alone. "There," Holmes murmured. "There lies the heart of the rot." As Miss Norwood reached the climactic pose, the outstretched arms, the silent scream, there was a sound, a soft but unmistakable gasp, and then the scuff of retreating footsteps from the gallery above. Holmes rose like a hunting hawk. "Come, Watson, the curtain is rising." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Holmes moved through the theater's rafters like a man possessed, yet utterly silent, his coat drawn tight, his frame low against the dim catwalk that overlooked the upper gallery. I followed at a distance, my heart hammering with every footstep that threatened to echo. The shadowy figure we had seen retreating had slipped out through a side stairwell. Holmes descended swiftly, emerging into a corridor behind the upper gallery, where the thick velvet curtains muffled the outside world. "There's only one way they could have gone," Holmes said, barely above a whisper, "and only one place they would think to hide." He paused at a door marked "Costumes and Storage," cracked slightly ajar. Without hesitation, Holmes pushed it open. The room within was dim and cluttered. Mannequins, moth-eaten costumes, broken props from past productions, all cast in the blue glow of a flickering gas lamp. Amid the shadows stood a woman, half-turned, frozen like a figure from a half-remembered play. Miss Myra Valette. She had aged, yes, but there was no mistaking her. Her face still bore the cold symmetry I remembered from her portraits in Fenwick's collection. Yet her expression now was something altogether new. Raw fear, edged with defiance. "Miss Valette," Holmes said softly, stepping into the light, or should I say, the ghost who never quite left the stage. She said nothing, only looked past him toward me, as if measuring whether she could bolt. Holmes raised a gloved hand. "It won't do. Every exit is watched." "You think you know everything," she said bitterly. "But you know nothing." "Oh, I know a good deal. For instance, I know you orchestrated this spectacle not to mourn Celestine, but to bury her again. You believed the choreography was dead, lost to time, like your reputation. But when it resurfaced, when your old student dared to bring it back—" "She was going to ruin everything," Valette hissed, her voice rising. "You don't understand. That dance wasn't just movement, it was memory. It was a confession." Her voice trembled, and I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Holmes stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. "You feared the steps would speak the truth." "She changed it," Valette burst out. "Celestine altered the sequence. I saw it in rehearsal. She had encoded something. Something from that night, from the fire." "You mean the fire that claimed Madame Varenne?" Holmes asked calmly. A pause. Then, with terrifying finality, Valette nodded. "She didn't die in the fire, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "She was dead before the flames ever touched her." I felt the air shift in the room, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke with quiet precision. "And Celestine knew this?" "She witnessed it," Valette murmured. "She saw what I did, and instead of going to the police, she put it into the one language she believed no one else could read, her art. She was always dramatic like that." Holmes turned slightly toward me, and for a fleeting second, I caught a rare glint of something like sorrow in his eyes. "She was blackmailing you." "No," Valette said sharply. "It wasn't the money she wanted. She wanted me to confess, to come clean, to let the past surface. She said the truth wants to be seen, like some awful spiritualist. I told her she'd destroy us both." "And so," Holmes said grimly, "you destroyed her first." Valette stood straighter, her face set in stony resolve. "I didn't plan to kill her, not at first. I only meant to stop the performance. But when I saw her there, center stage, all those eyes on her, dancing my truth into the open, I couldn't let her finish. I found myself stepping back, the full horror of it crystallizing in my mind. 'She died,' I murmured. Not just because of what she remembered, but because she dared to remember it out loud." Holmes inhaled slowly, then turned away. "You'll come with us now, Miss Valette. Scotland Yard is waiting." She didn't resist. As we led her out into the light, the theater seemed to sigh around us, its secrets finally, unwillingly given voice. But Holmes said nothing. His silence spoke of heavier things, of guilt and genius, of genius wasted on the wrong stage. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The rain had begun again by the time we exited the theater, a fine drizzle that blurred the glow of the gas lamps and painted the cobblestones with shifting reflections. Miss Valette walked between us in silence, her hood pulled up, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a penitent woman on her way to the gallows. Lestrade and 2 constables waited at the end of the alley, near a covered carriage, their figures half-shadowed under the eaves. Holmes raised his hand as we approached, a signal of completion, and then, in an instant, the silence shattered. Valette moved. It wasn't a panicked scramble or clumsy dash. No, it was swift, rehearsed, almost graceful. A flash of silver from her wrist, something small and sharp, had been hidden beneath her sleeve. Holmes reacted instantly, twisting her arm before the blade could reach his ribs. She cried out, writhing like a dancer mid-turn, and then broke free in a movement so fluid and sudden that I stumbled backward. "Stop her!" I cried. She bolted toward the side alley, vanishing behind the row of carriages like a shadow disappearing behind a curtain. Lestrade cursed under his breath and gave chase, the constables right behind him. Holmes, without a word, was already sprinting after them. I followed, heart hammering in my ears, through puddles and smoke and the echo of shouting boots. Valette had chosen her escape well. The alleys behind the Lyric Theatre twisted like the backstage of an opera, brick corridors and rusted doors, crates and broken scenery strewn across the cobblestones. Rain slicked every surface. It was like pursuing a phantom through a labyrinth. Then came a cry, "There," followed by the sound of a constable slipping on wet stone. Holmes did not pause. He rounded the corner and emerged into a narrow courtyard behind a row of warehouses. And there she was. Miss Myra Valette stood on the edge of an old wooden platform, her cloak soaked, her breath visible in the damp air. The knife is still in her hand, trembling now. Holmes stepped forward, slowly. "Don't," he said, voice low and even. "This is not the stage for grand finales, Miss Valette." She gave a bitter laugh. "You of all people should understand. Every performer deserves an exit. One that doesn't end in ruin," Holmes countered. Behind us, Lestrade and the others arrived, circling her quietly. Her eyes flicked between them, calculating the odds. Perhaps still believing, even now, that she could escape the scene she herself had choreographed. But Holmes took a step closer, and this time there was something different in his tone. "You wish to control the narrative, Miss Valette, but real life does not wait for the curtain's rise. It breaks through whether you're ready or not. And now, at last, the truth has taken center stage." Her grip on the blade faltered. The defiance in her posture gave way to weariness. An actress who knew her role was finished. Then, without further resistance, she dropped the knife. It struck the wooden platform with a sound far smaller than I expected. A few heartbeats passed. Holmes exhaled. Lestrade stepped forward to take her into custody. As she was led away, she turned to Holmes one last time. "Celestine was right," she said, voice hoarse. The dance. It did speak. Just not in the way I'd hoped. Holmes said nothing. We stood in the courtyard for a long moment after she was gone. Rain dripped from the eaves. Somewhere, a cat mewed in the dark. I turned to Holmes. "Were you certain she would run?" "Quite," he said. "People who carry secrets that long rarely surrender them without a final performance." "And yet you allowed her to keep the knife?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I did not allow it, Watson. I anticipated it." "And if you had been wrong?" He gave me a faint, humorless smile. "Then this would be your story alone." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed the following morning dawned grey and listless, as if London itself wished to wash away the night's memories in fog and silence. Holmes sat motionless in his armchair at Baker Street, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes half closed. The fire crackled in the hearth, untouched. Even his pipe lay neglected on the table beside him. He had said little since Valet's arrest. I, however, could not keep still. I'd gone over every moment from the prior evening, the escape, the confrontation in the alley, Valet's final cryptic remark, and still found myself grappling with unanswered questions. "She confessed in action," I said at last, "but not in words." Holmes's eyes opened slowly. "Miss Valette is an artist, Watson. Her truths are always in performance. Words are too blunt a tool." "And yet," I said, "you're not satisfied." Holmes stood, moving to the mantel and lifting a scrap of paper he had tucked there. "Because, my dear fellow, the final clue lies not in what she did, but in what she never meant to show." He handed me the slip. It was a torn piece of sheet music, water-stained, scrawled with dancing notes and slanted writing. At the bottom, in pencil, was a date, September 3rd, and the initials CV. "Celestine Valette," I muttered, reading aloud. Holmes nodded. "I retrieved this from the lining of Myra Valette's travel case. She had concealed it within the velvet. It was not addressed to her. It was written by her sister, the late Celestine. A rough sketch of a composition, perhaps her last." "Notice anything about it?" I studied it more carefully. The melody was hauntingly simple, rising and falling in melancholic cadence. But near the end, there was a sudden, jarring change in rhythm, two harsh, almost frantic notations that interrupted the flow. Holmes pointed. "Those last two bars, musically awkward, almost violent." Not her style. Perhaps she was experimenting. Or perhaps, Holmes said softly, she was trying to say something, without saying it. "You recall the rehearsal report. Celestine had grown distant, withdrawn. She feared something. That alteration was no flourish. It was a cry." I looked up, heart sinking. "A warning." Holmes paced. "I believe so. A warning she knew no one would hear but her sister. Myra would understand its meaning, not musically, but emotionally. That she was in danger, and from whom?" I sat back slowly, letting it settle. "You believe Myra did not just kill out of jealousy or pride. She killed to silence the dance before it revealed the truth." Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved a slim envelope. "And yet she made one final error, Watson. One piece remained outside her choreography." He handed it to me. Inside was a photograph. It showed Myra and Celestine together, in costume, beside a man with a violin, tall, gaunt, and unmistakably the composer, Bellamy. But what caught my attention was the reflection in the studio's glass behind them. A fourth figure, a man, seated just out of frame, looking down at something in his hands. It was blurred, but unmistakably there. "Who is that?" Holmes answered without hesitation. "Victor Sewell, the critic." He was more than a patron. He was an intimate companion of Celestine. One Myra feared would lead her sister away from the company. From her. I felt a chill. So the motive wasn't artistic pride. It was an obsession. Holmes looked into the fire. Celestine was preparing to leave, both the company and Myra. Her dance, that final piece, was not simply a composition. It was a goodbye. Myra understood too late and sought to control the ending. There was silence between us, thick and solemn. I stared at the photograph, at the blurred reflection of a man whose presence had been scrubbed from every account of the company's inner circle. Perhaps by design, perhaps by someone with influence or fear. "Have you told Lestrade?" I asked quietly. "I will," Holmes said, "but not before I speak to Sewell. There are still verses of this performance left unsung." Chapter 15. The final gathering. The drawing room of Myra Vallette's townhouse was a cathedral of silence. Gilded mirrors lined the walls, reflecting the pale morning light in the strained faces of those assembled. Holmes stood at the mantelpiece, the fire at his back, and I, as ever, took my place beside him. Silent, watchful, my notebook unopened. Inspector Lestrade was present, arms crossed, his mustache twitching with restrained impatience. Beside him sat Claude Bellamy, pale and drawn, his left hand wrapped in a silk handkerchief. Miss Lydia Finch, the understudy, perched nervously at the edge of a chaise, glancing often toward Myra Vallette, who had been released under supervision pending formal charges. She stood with an air of controlled poise near the window, back straight, but I could see the tremor in her hands. And then there was Victor Sewell seated alone in the corner. The critic, who had until now been only a name in the shadows, had been summoned by Holmes himself. Holmes turned slowly to face them. "I thank you for indulging me in this final act," he said. "You will find, I believe, that the truth often waits not in confession, but in confrontation." No one spoke. He moved to the center of the room. "Mr. Sewell," Holmes said, "you knew Celestine Vallette intimately." Sewell's eyes flicked toward Myra, then back. "I did. Yet you denied any involvement when questioned by Inspector Lestrade." "My relationship with the Vallette sisters was personal," he said stiffly, "not criminal." "Indeed. And yet your absence from the narrative, the way you were erased, suggests not discretion, but fear." "Why?" Sewell said nothing. Holmes continued, "Because you were the one Celestine planned to leave with. You were her escape, weren't you? Her exit from the company. From Myra." At this, Myra turned sharply, her mouth tightening. "She had every intention," Holmes said, "of announcing her departure after the autumn recital. A final performance, and then freedom." The new choreography, what she called the farewell, was both a tribute and a warning. Bellamy cleared his throat. "She never showed it to me." "She showed it to Myra," Holmes replied coolly. "Not in full, but enough for her to understand." He lifted the torn sheet music and passed it to Bellamy. "This," Holmes said, "is the final composition, found hidden in Celestine's effects. You will notice its structure deviates from her past work. It is erratic, desperate, as if written in fear. And that is precisely what it was." Lestrade leaned forward. "Fear of what?" Holmes didn't answer him. Instead, he stepped toward Myra. "You saw the dance," he said quietly. "Not just its movements, but its meaning. Celestine was trying to tell you something, that she was leaving you, that she was afraid." Myra's expression remained cold. "You interpret too much from art, Mr. Holmes." "And yet," he said gently, "you destroyed the one artifact that could speak in her voice. You altered the choreography. You tore pages from her journals. You silenced her music with poison." Lydia Finch gasped. Bellamy turned away. Myra said nothing. "It was not envy that drove you," Holmes said. "It was grief before the loss had occurred. a desperate attempt to preserve what you believed belonged to you. But in the act of preserving, you destroyed. Holmes turned to Lestrade. You will find the missing pages in the drawer beneath the stage at the Harmonium Theatre. Miss Valette concealed them after Celestine's death. I imagine they will contain early versions of the farewell, including references to Mr. Sewell. Sewell looked down, his face pale. Lestrade exhaled. We'll see to it. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Myra stepped forward. Her gaze swept across each of us. Not bitter, not ashamed, almost serene. She was my sister, she said quietly. She would have been lost without me. I only wanted to keep her safe. No, Holmes replied. You wanted her to remain yours. She did not resist when Lestrade moved to place her under formal arrest. There was no struggle, no outburst, only silence, as she was led from the room, her shadow trailing behind her like the final curtain fall of a long-forgotten performance. Holmes remained by the fire, the torn music in his hand. He studied it a moment longer, then set it down gently on the mantel, as though at a grave. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes Breaks Down the Crime. It was some hours later, with rain needling softly at the windows of Baker Street, that Holmes sat across from me, violin untouched, eyes distant but alive with that strange light they always carried in the wake of intellectual conquest. The fire crackled low. He had lit his pipe, and the blue-gray smoke drifted upward, spiraling like the ghost of a waltz. I, with pen in hand, prepared to gather the tangle of threads he had so masterfully unraveled. Begin at the beginning, Holmes, I said gently. You owe it to the reader. He exhaled slowly. It began not with death, Watson, but with obsession. Myra Valette's love for her sister was fierce, but it was a love poisoned by possession. From childhood, Celestine was her mirror, her muse, and eventually her creation. She taught her to dance. She shaped her entire life. Celestine's fame was a reflection of Myra's choreography. But when Celestine began to assert herself artistically, creating her own pieces, building her own name, it threatened that dynamic. And when she prepared to leave both the stage and her sister behind, Myra's identity fractured. But why murder? I asked. Surely artistic jealousy, even twisted love, could have found expression in exile, not poison. Holmes nodded. Ordinarily, yes. But you saw the extent of Myra's control, the strict rehearsals, the isolated living arrangements. Celestine's planned departure, particularly with Victor Sewell, represented not only abandonment, but betrayal. To Myra, it was death already. Poison merely made it literal. He rose then and began pacing slowly. The real genius of the crime was in its concealment. Myra used Bellamy's composition as a weapon, swapping the original with a doctored score laced with a mercury compound that would be absorbed through the skin. It was applied to the paper's edges, particularly on the final pages of the farewell sequence. And Celestine's collapse occurred immediately after rehearsing that very sequence. Precisely. The poison was not instant. It required repeated contact. Myra timed it perfectly, knew her sister's obsessive practice schedule. She even delayed the public premiere, ensuring exposure long enough to be fatal. But the torn pages? Destroyed deliberately. The music held clues. Celestine's marginal notes, her annotations regarding Sewell. If those had surfaced, Myra's motive would have become evident. She needed to erase both the piece and the passion behind it. I frowned. And Lydia Finch? An unfortunate near victim. Myra suspected Lydia had seen something. When Lydia was set to perform Celestine's role in the revival, Myra tampered again, this time with a small pendant Lydia wore during rehearsal, coated in the same mercury compound. Subtler, more delayed. But I intercepted it. I sat back, astonished. You never told me. Holmes smiled faintly. I needed to be certain. and I needed Myra to believe her plan remained unnoticed. Only then would she gather enough confidence to attend the final confrontation. I shook my head. But it was Claude Bellamy who was injured, the wound to his hand. Holmes's face darkened. An accident. He picked up a page Myra had discarded hastily after rehearsing alone, a fragment still laced with the compound. He's fortunate it was brief. We were silent for a time. Outside, the rain picked up, a steady patter upon the sill. "And the dance?" I asked. "What did it predict?" Holmes's eyes drifted toward the ceiling. Her own death. Celestine knew her sister would not let her go. The choreography, its sharp stops, the way it ended mid-movement, was a message, a cry for help, though perhaps not even she fully grasped it. Art sometimes speaks truths its creator cannot voice aloud. He turned toward me then. "And so we find ourselves again, Watson, not in the realm of blood and blade, but of sorrow and silence. Myra loved her sister too much to live without her, and far too much to let her live free." A chill moved through me, colder than the wind outside. Holmes tapped out his pipe, and the embers faded to black. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The drawing room of the Valette household was still a mausoleum. Inspector Lestrade stood near the hearth, flipping through his notes with a scowl that did little to mask his astonishment. Holmes sat languidly near the piano, his fingers lightly tracing the keys without sound. Myra Valette stood in the center of the room, rigid and pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together by force. "Miss Valette," Lestrade said, breaking the silence with that clipped, officious tone he used when he sensed the magnitude of a case escaping him, "you're hereby placed under arrest for the murder of your sister, Celestine Valette, by means of poisoning." She didn't move. Her lips barely parted. "You have no proof." Holmes stood now, his tone impossibly gentle. "Proof? My dear madam, your fingerprints were found on the missing score, fragment recovered from Bellamy's residence. That fragment, still faintly reactive to mercury chloride under chemical analysis, matches precisely with the pages missing from Celestine's personal score book, pages only someone intimate with her routine would know how to target." Her composure faltered. A trembling breath escaped her, but still she did not weep. Holmes continued, his voice softening not in pity but in precision. "Furthermore, Lydia Finch was nearly felled by the same compound, this time administered via a costume accessory you personally handled before the dress rehearsal. Your intentions may have been masked as tribute, but your fingerprints, again, tell their own tale." Myra glanced once at the mirror over the mantel, as if seeking refuge in her own reflection, then turned her gaze on Holmes. "I didn't want to kill her," she said at last. "I only wanted her to stay." Holmes did not reply. He merely inclined his head, a gesture not of absolution, but of acknowledgement. She looked toward Lestrade and, without protest, held out her wrists. Lestrade stepped forward, cuffs ready. "We'll let the courts decide the rest." As she was led away, her footsteps echoed faintly against the marble tiles, the only sound save for the low moan of the wind beyond the curtained windows. Holmes watched without expression. He didn't speak until the door clicked shut behind her. "I believe," he said, turning to me, "that obsession, like fire, may warm or consume. In Miss Valette's case, it did both." "Do you suppose she ever realized how deeply she was unraveling?" I asked. He paused, then shook his head. "I think she mistook control for affection, and in the end, lost both." We left the house shortly after, and the air outside was brisk with the scent of approaching snow. London's lamps burned softly through the mist, giving the streets a ghostly cast. As we hailed a cab back to Baker Street, I could not help but think of Celestine, the way her name still shimmered on posters outside the closed theater, as if she were alive in some other hour of time. Inside the cab, I turned to Holmes. Do you think Bellamy will ever compose again? Perhaps, Holmes replied, but he will never write another farewell. That much I'm sure of. He pulled his collar up against the cold and closed his eyes, his mind, so recently ablaze, already receding into its private, unknowable depths. I looked out the window, London rolling by in soft, flickering shapes, and wondered not for the first time what price brilliance extracts from those who chase it and from those who happen to love them. Chapter 18. Holmes's final reflection. It was a quiet afternoon on Baker Street, several days after Myra Valette had been remanded into custody. A fire crackled gently in the grate. The soft tick of the mantel clock was the only sound between us. I sat opposite Holmes, who lounged as ever in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. He had not touched his violin all day, a sure sign his mind was still moving through the final echoes of the case. The newspapers had, of course, taken great liberties with the tale. The Star declared it a murder in 3 acts, while the Telegraph dubbed it a poisoned prima donna's last beau. Scotland Yard, as expected, took public credit for the solution, and Lestrade was enjoying a brief flurry of praise he did not entirely deserve. Public attention, Holmes remarked dryly, setting his tea down, is a gas that inflates or suffocates depending on who breathes it. I, for one, have no taste for it. I smiled faintly. And yet you allowed Lestrade to take all the glory. Let him, Holmes said. The more they cheer him, the less they notice how often he's a step behind. It affords me a very useful invisibility. I leaned forward. Still the case. It was an unusually delicate one, not in method but in motive. Holmes gave a slow nod. Indeed, Myra Valette was no common criminal. She was, in fact, one of the most intelligent adversaries we've yet faced. Her actions were driven not by greed or fear, but by the illusion that love, when twisted tightly enough, becomes necessity. She wanted her sister to stay, I murmured, and when she couldn't, she ensured she would be remembered. Holmes looked toward the window. A low fog clung to the city, softening the outline of the rooftops. Yes, Celestine was slipping away, emotionally, artistically, even physically. Myra had spent her life playing second violin to a symphony she could never conduct. She feared abandonment so intensely that she created a kind of permanence out of tragedy. And the dance, I asked. Do you believe it truly predicted death, as Lydia claimed? Holmes tilted his head. The dance was a symbol, Watson, a mirror of the inner lives of its performers. It revealed obsession, not because it was prophetic, but because it was precise. Like all great art, it simply reflected the truth that no one dared say aloud. I sat in silence for a long moment, digesting this. Then, with a thought, I said, it struck me that the poisoned dance shoes, the very instruments of death, were worn willingly. Celestine put them on with joy, never knowing their purpose. There's something tragic in that. Holmes looked at me with one of those rare expressions, soft, reflective, touched by something deeper. Yes, Watson, he said. As with so many things in life, we step into danger not through compulsion, but through longing. Celestine longed for her final performance, and Myra longed for her not to vanish. Each woman reached for something beautiful, and in so doing, one destroyed the other. He stood and moved to the window, watching the drifting fog beyond. In the end, the most dangerous poisons are not chemical. They are the quiet ones: jealousy, dependency, the slow erosion of identity under the weight of devotion. I found myself strangely moved. The room felt unusually heavy, as if the echoes of the case still lingered like notes from a fading aria. At length, Holmes turned from the window, his manner brisk once again. But enough of that. There is a matter of a forger in Southwark I've promised to assist with. Shall we, Watson? I rose, reaching for my coat. Wherever you lead, Holmes. As we descended the stairs and stepped once more into the thrum of London life, I thought not of murder or deduction, but of sisters, dancers, and the fragile steps we all take through the lives of those we love. And above it all, Holmes walked onward, his mind already miles ahead, his heart an enigma even the greatest detective could never quite solve.